very, very excited to welcome Dr. Ben Rein, who's going to be talking about isolation and connection and how it affects not only our happiness, but also our longevity.
I have to start by making a confession. I'm really embarrassed to say this. I did something horrible last week. I went to the grocery store, grabbed all my items, approached the checkout area, and I was presented with two options. One option was the self-checkout machine, and the other was the human cashier beckoning me, come to my line, come on. I was in a rush. You can guess what the decision was that I made. I unfortunately went to the self-checkout line, and I want to ask by a show of hands, who else is guilty of this? Please tell me I'm not alone, especially when there's a human cashier available. You know, I also have to admit, sometimes I do something else terrible. I order my groceries to be delivered right to my house instead of going and immersing myself in my community who accompanies me in this. The third awful thing that I've done recently is I checked into my hotel using the digital key function, once again bypassing any human contact, going right past the concierge comfortably to my solitude of my room. Who else has joined me in that? Yeah. These are convenient things, right? The reason we have our hands up is because it makes life easier. But unfortunately, it not only makes life easier, but it removes certain interactions from our lives that I believe are really meaningful. These are all examples of what I call the automation of everything. And it's everywhere in life. It's not just these things. You know, we can work from home nowadays. We can work out from home through a screen. We can see our doctor without seeing our doctor. We can even get a taxi without having to interact with another human because it's driven by itself. And I think this is just one, this automation of everything is just one example of what's driving us into what I call a post-interaction world. Might seem a little bit dramatic, but hear me out. In addition to the automation of everything, we also went through COVID-19 recently, which was arguably the most isolating event in human history. We have the rise of social media and virtual contact so that we can Zoom, we can FaceTime. If I were not here in person, if I were to pop in on the screen and give the talk virtually, you probably wouldn't think much of it because that's kind of the world we live in nowadays. We have to mention political polarization. The country is intensely divided along political lines. We also have socially charged media. So when Friday night rolls around and you're deciding, should I go meet my friends or should I stay home and sit on the couch and turn on the TV? Well, what's on the TV? Things that tickle our brain's social systems, right? You can watch people argue. If you want to learn something, you can learn it by watching people communicate in the form of a conversation, right? These modern ways that we engage with media really tickle our brain's social systems and become an allure that kind of maybe keeps us from meeting our friends out. And lastly, shout out to Sarah with the AI talk. We not only have AI companions that help us out in our businesses, but there are now actually AI friends and romantic partners. I'm not kidding, you can look it up. There are tools that are meant to replace romantic partners, and there are more and more people using these tools, once again replacing relationships. So in my book that just came out in October, I have 3 hard truths. The first is that we live in a divided world. It's not just that the anecdotes that I'm saying are, things that I've noticed, but the data is really there. Between 2013 and 2021, the amount of time that Americans spent alone increased by 36 hours per month. Almost an entire work week now spent alone. Maybe it's from COVID, but the trend seems to continue in 2022. 58% of Americans reported being lonely. And by 2025, just last year, almost 70% report lacking emotional support. I think this matters because of my hard truth number 2, which is that division is the enemy of brain health. Human beings are meant to be together. We survive best in groups, and so our brains reward us for being around others and punish us for being isolated. We'll get more into that in a moment. But if we just look at the sort of cost of isolation, being isolated is associated with higher rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide. If you look at prisoners, if they were held in solitary confinement for any amount of time during their stay, when they were released, they are 78% more likely to die by suicide in the first year, any amount of time in solitary confinement. But it's not just our mood that's at risk, it's our physiology as well. Increased risk of dementia, stroke, diabetes, heart failure, and a range of other things I couldn't fit on the slide that collectively amount in a 50% higher risk of death by any cause. I'm so sorry, this is extremely depressing and terrifying, but the good news is there's hope on the horizon. The reason that this is so maybe bad is because, like I said, our brains punish us for isolation. Our bodies perceive loneliness as a form of stress, because in an ancient world, being removed from your tribe and your community was a risk of death. You could be much more easily killed or be unable to hunt by yourself. So when you're isolated, it triggers the activation of our brain's stress response systems and drives up cortisol levels. And if this is sustained over the long term, that high cortisol can result in inflammation that then poses a health burden. To explain a little bit more of like an example of how this might happen, I want to turn to a study that was done not far from here in Houston by a professor called Luis McCullough. Hopefully you can kind of see this, it's not really presenting very well, but they were doing stroke research in mice. And if you can kind of make out, this is the stroke area in both of these images. And what they found was that for some reason, some of the mice in their study had much larger strokes. Maybe you can see it. Turned out when they looked into it, the mice that were having larger strokes, even though they went through the exact same stroke protocol, they should hypothetically have the same exact stroke, larger stroke, is because they were living alone. They thought maybe it had something to do with that inflammation that I mentioned. But when they suppressed inflammation, they saw that even if isolated, mice had those same size strokes. So you can think about it as like being isolated seems to kind of prime our brains and bodies toward dysfunction, so that when something bad happens, like a stroke or a heart attack, it may be exacerbated, it may be worse, we may be less likely to recover, and also we are more likely to have those adverse events. So when we talk about longevity, it's important to note this right here. This is real data from Americans showing the amount of time we spend alone as we age. And what you can see is that it just continuously rises higher and higher, and above 65 is when it's the highest. The reason I think this is maybe the greatest public health crisis of all time is that being above 65 is in itself a health risk factor, right? You're at a higher risk of stroke, dementia, heart disease, all these things. Being isolated is now superimposed on top of it, making those health crises even worse. And I mentioned 50% higher risk of death by any cause. It's even higher in those above 65. So isolated people are 78% more likely to die if they are men, 57% for women. So sorry, I told you this would be a little bit depressing. But let's look on the bright side. Where's the way out, right? We find ourselves in this dark place. How can we find our way out? Well, the title of my book is Why Brains Need Friends, the Neuroscience of Social Connection. And I'm asked a lot, what do I mean by social connection? To me, social connection is both deep and shallow. I actually like to think of it like a pool. And just like you can swim at any depth in a pool, you can swim at any depth in connection. In the deep end, you might have a deep heart-to-heart with a friend. In a more shallow area, you might have lunch with a coworker. Over here in the shallow end, you might have a chat with a stranger, but you can even go more shallow than that. You can simply dip your toe in and wave hi to a neighbor or thank your bus driver as you get off, right? All of these forms of connection at any depth are good for us. There's a lot of evidence showing that there's a benefit of social connection, even if it's just a momentary interaction. The reason for that, presumably, is again because our evolutionary history favors it. So when we connect for even a brief amount of time, it lights up these systems in our brain that tell us you're doing the right thing. There's a whole system here called the social reward system that oxytocin, this love hormone, the social bonding neurotransmitter, it drives the release of dopamine and serotonin, two neurotransmitters you've likely heard of before, because they're very popular. They're very good neurotransmitters, right? They're associated with positive mood, reinforcement. When we connect, this is what happens. Our brains make us feel good, and that's a system meant to keep us around others for our survival in the past. But nowadays, you can leverage that to your advantage by simply connecting with people and experiencing the good mood. We may live in a different world nowadays where our survival doesn't depend on connectedness, but we still have this same old hardware in our heads, and we can actually use that to our benefit. In addition to those mood effects, there's also a lot of health effects, just systemically, also linked to oxytocin, interestingly enough. This was something I actually learned while writing my book, that oxytocin has all of these amazing benefits. It's anti-inflammatory, it can promote immune function, bone growth, wound healing, so much so to the point that researchers have asked if it's nature's medicine. So when we talk about these doses, or this pool of social connection, you can think about it in terms of doses. You don't always have to swim in the deep end. You don't always have to connect with a friend and have a heart-to-heart. You can just take a little mini dose here and there and thank your bus driver. When we go to the self-checkout line, when we walk past the concierge like I did, you're depriving yourself of these microdoses of connection that boost not only your health, but also your mood. So when we go back to this question of where's the way out, I have 6 takeaways that might be helpful for you, that are at least my suggestions. Number 1, as I said, swim at various depths. And that means not only having a range of different types of interactions, but also interacting with a range of different social partners. There's evidence that actually having a more broad, diverse social network is associated with greater benefits. And there's a huge amount of research showing that interacting with strangers can be very, very beneficial. I think that's something, a very ripe fruit that we often miss out on. Second, I encourage you to find your dose. What I mean by that is we all exist somewhere on a continuum from introversion to extroversion. And a good way to think about this is like we're all a potted plant. Some potted plants require very little watering to be healthy. Some potted plants need a lot of watering. That's the difference really between introverts and extroverts. Introverts can get by with very little interaction and be happy, and they are very easily overwatered, as the introverts in the crowd can certainly relate to. Extroverts are harder to overwater, but it's more likely that their soil will dry out quicker. And the key is if you can understand where you exist on this continuum, you can try to figure out what's the right cadence that your plant needs to be watered. And importantly, how can you avoid your soil drying out? And to that end, at the end, I have a QR code where you can scan and take an extroversion assessment to figure out where you actually exist. It's also in the book. Number 3, craft your social diet. So I recommend this advice or this idea of social journaling, that let's say you come home from a social interaction and you take a bunch of notes. You write down, where were you, who were you with, how long were you there, how many people were there, was it too many people, were you there for too long? What would you change about the interaction if you could? Because think about our diets. Everyone at lunch may have, skipped out on the cheese or skipped out on the meat, right? We all know what our diets should be to make us feel best, but we don't apply that same level of attention and detail to crafting our social diet. I think we should. What do we stand to lose from crafting our interactions? And also, by doing this practice, you can also start to figure out what the right cadence of interaction is for you. Number 4, there's a lot of evidence that being nice to other people and expressing gratitude both benefit you if you're the person doing the nice thing. So I call this idea selfish selflessness, that you can be kind to others but benefit yourself. Maybe it's a little controversial, I'm not sure, but I think if it ends up with you being happier and healthier and another person feeling better, there's no reason to not use it for your own benefit. Number 5, I encourage everyone to level up your social interactions when they're virtual. So nowadays, there's all these different ways we can interact, and I like to think of it kind of like a staircase, right? The bottom step, you can just text message someone. You can go to a phone call, video call, or face-to-face. Research suggests that the more lifelike your interactions are, the more enjoyable they are. And it makes sense, because if you think about it, when you text someone, you're just getting their words. You can't hear their tone of voice, you can't see their face. When you move up to a phone call, now you can hear their voice. When you move to a video call, you can see their body language and their facial expressions. These are all cues that your brain uses to recognize I'm interacting with another human. And when we think about all those systems in the brain that make us feel good, that improve our health when we interact with others, driven largely by oxytocin, what do you think drives the oxytocin? Well, it's the recognition that we are connecting with someone. So if we can restore the texture back to our interactions by leveling them up, ideally all the way to face, where you have eye contact, touch, and even social smells, then we can gather the most benefit from our interactions. And by the way, there was some mention earlier about emojis. There actually may be reason to suggest using emojis for our health, because if you think about it, if we're in just text message mode, but we can add facial expressions, we're restoring a little bit of that texture, and there is actually evidence that the brain responds to emojis similar to human faces of emotional expressions. Lastly, number 6, don't fall for bad predictions. So there's a ton of bad social predictions that we are prone to. We tend to underestimate the benefits of connecting with others. We think it's way more likely that others will reject us than they actually do. In truth, people are very nice. We think that the longer we stay in a conversation, the worse it will get. not true. It generally is kind of stable. There's definitely an upper limit, though. Uh, we tend to underestimate our own social skills, and we also think people don't like us as much as they really do. To me, it makes perfect sense. There's a lot riding on our reputation, right? It matters to be accepted. At one point, it was life or death. If people didn't like you in your community, they'd kick you out, you were going to die. So it's important. We care about being liked. We care about making good impressions. So this is natural. A bit of social anxiety is natural. So when it comes to Friday night and you're trying to decide, should you watch The Real Housewives or should you go meet your friends at the dinner plans you already said you were going to? And you start to have some of these fears, is it going to be awkward? Am I going to say something weird? Is it going to be a lot of energy and I'm not going to feel better after? Just remember, it's entirely natural to feel that way. And it's almost guaranteed, unless your plant is overwatered, that you will feel better after the interaction. So where can you start today? Well, here's a list of those 6 practices summarized into 5. That QR code will take you to the webpage where you can download those resources, the social journaling template and the extroversion assessment. But what I would ask for you today is before you leave, take a dip in the shallow end. I'm sure you've already been doing lots of this today, but find someone you don't know and tell them about the best thing that happened to you this week. Because I promise you, they are less likely to reject you than you think, and you will feel much better after than you expect to. And if you can incorporate practices like that in your daily life, I promise you will live a longer, healthier, happier life. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ben. Your last point was exactly what we were promoting all day long. Make new friends. Okay, we've got a lot of questions for you. You talked about the benefit to mood, with social connection. How does insufficient social connection manifest in terms of brain health? How does it impact brain health?
Well, it starts as a stress response, right? And over time, it can, like I pointed out, lead to higher risk of stroke, dementia. The other thing about being isolated that I didn't have time for in my slides, but it's important, is that it doesn't only affect your brain health, it also affects your psychology in that people who are isolated kind of remain isolated. They tend to experience less joy. They actually experience less social reward from interacting. They show lower rises in oxytocin when they connect. They have trouble trusting others, and therefore others have trouble trusting them. They actually show larger brain responses to negative social information than positive. So once you are isolated, there's actually a range of social or of psychological changes that actually kind of keep you isolated, or at least remove some of the joy and benefit of connection. So it's important, if you are in that place or someone in your life is in that place, to take your time with it and to understand that it may take a few social interactions before you really start to feel like yourself. And everybody went through COVID, right? Remember when we had to go back to work and all of a sudden you felt really kind of awkward and rusty and it just didn't feel normal? Kind of like that, but on a more minor scale is how it can be affected.
Nice. So I know you talked about we're wired for this because we are tribal, and how does having social connections on work teams, how does that impact us now in the modern day?
Well, I think, I always try to endorse as much community everywhere as possible for obvious reasons after you just heard that talk. But I think one of the best ways to bring people together is to show them what they have in common. And again, tribalism, right? Our brains are really, really good at noticing this person is different from me, this person is more like me, and actually there's a lot of evidence that you're more likely to like the person who you perceive like you, is being like you, and you're also more likely to empathize with them. There's literally greater activity in empathy-related areas. So I think in a sort of business setting, if we're trying to build camaraderie, it's important to help people understand what they have in common. Not only the fact that they're working on the same project, but also letting them get to know each other and sort of complexify the human, right? You see the work version of them, but maybe they have the same type of dog as you and they like to play fetch as well, or maybe they listen to the same CD in their car, right? If we can expand our understanding of others, that allows for sort of the Venn diagram of you and them to start to overlap more, then it can really build further connection.
So then, how does this affect neurodivergence?
It's a really good question. It's funny. I had an entire chapter in my book. I was supposed to have an entire chapter on the neurobiology of autism, which was my PhD research topic, and my publisher removed it. Hopefully my publisher's not in the room. Yeah, I mean, I think that what I've understood is that once you meet one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, right? And so I think everyone is different. Same thing with, those not on the spectrum. But, in my perspective is that like the introversion extroversion scale, right? Everyone falls on that. And so, like I have a friend, he's on the autism spectrum. He's extreme extrovert, and he may struggle to interact and maybe feel a little bit more uncomfortable, but he craves interaction all the time. And I spend a lot of time with him. And so I think it's a very complicated question, and I'm actually not exactly sure how it fits into, because a lot of the research I'm talking about is done on neurotypical populations.
Right. Are there types of connection that matter more?
Yeah, I would say certain relationships that matter more. When we're talking about oxytocin, the greatest oxytocin pulse you can possibly achieve is going to be with your romantic partner and with your children. And I have a 4-month-old at home, so I'm very much in the middle of that. But it makes sense if you think about it evolutionarily, because the two main goals evolutionarily for humans and all species are survive and reproduce. When you meet a romantic partner and you are in position to reproduce, it's really important that you're very healthy. So all that oxytocin has all those great benefits, makes you feel really good, makes you feel really healthy, increases your likelihood of reproduction. Now the baby's here, now you need to be even more healthy so you can successfully raise the child. And so I'm personally benefiting from it right now, although oxytocin's surging.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben.
Yeah.
Really
Thank you.
appreciate it. Thank you.